Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's special event for Curators Circle and AGO Next members. My name is Julian Cox. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the AGO, and I'm speaking to you from land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation, and was also the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and Seneca nations through time. As we proceed through this evening's presentation, I encourage all of you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, which we'd be very happy to answer towards the end of the presentation. I'm really delighted to welcome you tonight to a presentation around the exhibition Studio 54 Night Magic, which of course was meant to open just before the holiday season at the end of last year, but our plans to do so were squashed by the pandemic. So the exhibition is installed and looks really fantastic in our space, but we can't quite yet welcome you all in to see it, but we hope to do so as soon as it is safe to do so. And so we look forward to welcoming you in the weeks ahead. Of course, enterprising and ambitious projects of this scale cannot be accomplished without generous support of numerous donors and supporters and a network of individuals and organizations that make efforts like this possible. The show that we're presenting at the AGO is organized by the Brooklyn Museum. We've had very important sponsorship from Johnnie Walker Scotch Whisky. We have a special thanks to our supporting sponsor, Shiseido, and also contemporary programming at the AGO is generously supported by the Canada Council for the Arts. Important to say also that this exhibition is presented in collaboration with Spotify, the founding partner of Studio 54 and the exhibition organized by the Brooklyn Museum. The curator of the show is my colleague, Matthew Jakubowski, who has been just a terrific collaborator all along. He was appointed Senior Curator of Fashion and Material Culture in 2018 at the Brooklyn Museum, having most recently held the position of Director of Exhibition Design. Prior to joining the Brooklyn Museum, Matthew was the Associate Curator of Film and Video at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he curated No Wave Cinema, 78 to 87, and which also had an important international tour, Fashion and Film, 1997, and also while at the Whitney, he was the exhibition designer for many important permanent collection shows, the Whitney Biennial in 1995, for example, and Edward Steichen 2000, among many other projects. Since 1999, Matthew has designed over 95 temporary and permanent exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum. Imagine that. Just a few highlights of his work there include the exhibition Annie Leibovitz, A Photographer's Life from 2006, Murakami, 2008, Who Shot Rock and Roll, A Photographic History, 1955 to the present, Basquiat, The Unknown Notebooks from 2015, the Killer Heels, The Art of the High-Heeled Shoe, 2014, and The Rise of Sneaker Culture, 2015. The list just goes on and on. And just to sort of cap it off, most recently, he curated and designed the exhibition Pierre Cardin, Future Fashion. That was in 2019. And of course, Pierre Cardin has very sadly just recently died. And then this year, on top of Studio 54, he also organized The Queen and the Crown, a virtual exhibition of costumes from The Queen's Gambit and The Crown. So all of those of you who've been relying on Netflix to get you through the pandemic should know about that most recent project that Matthew has organized. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Matthew. Good to have you along.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much, Julian. And thank you so much to the Art Gallery of Ontario for bringing the exhibition to Toronto. You know, it's a big project, and it's the first time I've ever installed an exhibition virtually, but I think we all had a great time doing it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it was, to that point, Matthew, it was really an extraordinary first for both of us, you know, because this exhibition opened in Brooklyn on March 13th, I think it was, of last year, and of course immediately had to shut down. and then you had, in the end, I think, quite a limited run for the show in Brooklyn. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Uh, well, on March 11th, we had a really big party, which a lot of people today say was the last party before COVID, and which I don't know if that's good or bad. The following day we were to open, and the pandemic set in. And originally they said we would be closed for 2 weeks, but it ended up being 6.5 months. And we opened in mid-September. And we ran for about 10 weeks before we closed in early November. I would, one of the behind the scenes stories I would say is just that when you install a show and you have 85 lenders, and you have a pandemic, you have to go in and have conversations with all 85 again about having a show where you lock the door, but keep everybody apprised that everything's safe and smooth. So.
Quite something to navigate all of that. Matthew, I had described a little bit about the extraordinary range of projects that you've done over your career as both an exhibition designer and a scholar and a thinker. But what led you to Studio 54 as a subject?
Well, one of the shows you mentioned that I'd worked on earlier was No Wave Cinema, which looked at the history of punk filmmaking in the East Village in New York City. And another was Who Shot Rock and Roll, which was a history of rock and roll photography. And I really like exploring music, the visualization of music, which was what made me very excited when I worked on our presentation of the Bowie exhibition, which you had also hosted in Toronto.
That's right.
I'm, my background's in film. I have a little history in theater, and I'm always very interested in subjects that kind of bring performative aspects to a project. And the challenge of bringing that into a museum, how do you bring in something that's a live art into a museum and still have it feel like it has that same excitement? So that was kind of the hook for me. And then also because I also enjoy projects which people haven't really done before. And so this was looking at the artistic history of a nightclub, which I couldn't find another example of anyone doing. So that kind of made it even a little bit more appealing.
And this isn't just any nightclub. It's sort of the nightclub, really, in a way, of the 20th century, certainly in North America. So maybe you could just very quickly give us a sense of exactly where the nightclub was and the period, date-wise, that the exhibition covers.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is that New York City hadn't had a big nightclub in 2 decades, really, before Studio 54 opened on April 26, 1977. So most people know the 70s as the era of disco music, which kind of grew up in underground nightclubs, gay nightclubs, African-American nightclubs, Latin nightclubs in New York City. But they were all kind of like loft spaces. And so New York City at the time was a little bit in a depression. And if you see photographs of New York in the 70s, it was, it was a little bit beat up. And so a lot of artists moved to New York at that time because rents were cheap and inexpensive. Steve Rubel and Ian Schrager had both met at Syracuse University, and they had a nightclub called the Enchanted Garden in Queens, but they were having a hard time having people come out to Queens. They'd have to send buses to Manhattan and bring people out to have a cool night out there. So they were looking for various places in the city, and they came upon this building at 254 West 54th Street, which was a little bit just out of the Broadway zone. And what they did was they bought a building that had been a former opera house, a former CBS television studio. And the idea was that they were going to transform a theater into a nightclub, but yet keep the elements of the theater so that they could have a continually changing experience. So it was new, it was innovative. And I think today people really associate Studio 54 as kind of being the pinnacle place to go and dance to disco music.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great sort of synopsis of the club, and we're going to sort of take a little bit of a deeper dive now. But it's sort of wonderful to see this madding crowd that, of course, is so much not part of our life nowadays. But one of the things about Studio 54, which I've learned from working with you on this project, is the extraordinary collision of all the different sort of expressive art forms at this moment, and the way they seem to come together in a very dynamic way in the club. And the first picture we're going to look at just very quickly is, you'll notice the outside, the lettering, the logo for Studio 54. And here's how we've adapted it for the gallery, sort of for the installation, I should say, with sort of silver and black. But the logo was designed by a man called Gil Lesser, who is in his own right a very important graphic designer. So maybe you could just say a little bit about the design aesthetic of this period and the club.
Well, the building had been built in the late 1920s, which in America was our Art Deco period. And so the nightclub had Art Deco elements to it. And the architect that they brought in to work on the nightclub was named Ron Dowd. Ron Dowd had previously done the WPA restaurant, which was in the Soho section of Manhattan, and it was 1930s design. So they walked into the building, they liked the 20s, they tried to retain as many elements as they could, and then they contacted 4 designers to do graphic proposals. And this one by Gil Lesser, as you can see, is very Art Deco oriented. Gil was an art director at Life magazine and did the masthead for Life magazine. And so he had a very bold style. And the one note I would tell you about this is that when Gil originally designed it, it was horizontal. But Ian Schrager, who has this amazing eye, looked at it and decided it should be tilted. Yeah. And that became the final version of the logo.
It just adds that little sort of bit of extra dynamism to the presentation. And we had a lot of fun, our graphic design team, sort of working with you and talking about those variations as we were planning for the show. I want to just sort of move on now just to show everybody a couple of installation shots that give you a sense of how the exhibition feels at the AGO here. Of course, there's no madding crowd yet to see it, but we hope that'll happen soon. And just before I let you loose to say a few things about what people are looking at here, I wanted to mention especially the I Love New York logo, because Milton Glaser, who designed it, passed away in June of last year. I think he was in his early 90s, but this was, most people might forget, but that logo came about in this, I think it was the summer of '77, right at this moment, as you said, when New York was trying to sort of come out of a bit of a depression, a dark period, and regenerate itself. So in a sense, the club was very much a part of that moment of regeneration and new possibility in New York.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the I Love New York campaign actually started out the day after the great blackout of the summer of '77. And it was just by coincidence, but everybody felt like when it came out, it was really about everyone kind of galvanizing and showing their love for New York. The I Love New York campaign started the same year that Studio 54 did. And we also had a popular TV show called Saturday Night Live. And they were really rebranding New York City to make it a tourist destination. And it all kind of worked itself out over the years, and New York's influx of tourists kept increasing. And of course, Studio 54 had a lot of visitors, both national and international. It was very much a as you mentioned earlier, a collision of the arts. And
Mm.
what we're looking at here are examples of the fashions of the day. On the left, we see fashions by Norma Kamali. Norma Kamali is most well known for inventing the sleeping bag coat, which you see on the left, a version from the 70s and a later version. The door people at Studio 54 used to wear them at that time. And one note is that Norma at that time was also dating Ian Schrager. So there was a little bit of, working together. On the right, we see examples by several designers. We see Halston, we see Stephen Burrows, and Calvin Klein. And what's interesting is that they all went to Studio 54. They all kind of had their corner. So you were either kind of a part of the Halston crowd or the Calvin Klein crowd or the Stephen Burrows crowd. And it was all a little bit of a rivalry, but when you have a rivalry, great design happens.
Yes, of course.
Have that challenge.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll just mention in passing, where we can talk more about it, but is just, you can see it a little bit more maybe from the slide on the right, that one of the things that Matthew sort of did so skillfully with this exhibition is to integrate different kinds of art forms together. So there are the fashion pieces on the platform that you see on the right hand side, but then also the moving image, sort of video and film captured in the background there of the disco, dance floor lighting on the back on the screen there, and then other works on paper, photographs, prints, ephemera. I mean, one of the joys and the riches of the exhibition, I think, is the way that different kinds and classes of objects interact with each other to tell the story of the extraordinary sort of high octane story of this club over its 33-month history.
Yeah, and as we were talking earlier, it was very much a place where multiple arts were happening at once. You had the decor, you had the setting, you had the moving scenery, you had the fashion design, and of course you had the audio design. So music was very much a part of it. And I would just do a little plug here. If you go to Spotify and type in Studio 54 Night Magic, you can hear a great soundtrack the next time you're exercising at home during COVID. But what we're looking at here is Paul Matheson, who is a great lighting person who worked at Studio 54, works at the AGO. He was there when they had this neon lighting at Studio, which had been designed by Bran Farren. And Bran Farren's father was an abstract expressionist painter, but Bran had a lot of new ideas about how the designs at Studio could work. So Paul did a beautiful job of echoing that design.
Yeah, we had a very nice sort of exchange back and forth in how to adapt that to our galleries, and I'll give a little plug later on because we're doing another public program that features Paul in discussion with Matthew on January the 20th, so I'll mention that at the end of the talk. But sort of moving along, Matthew, I wanted to spend a few minutes now really talking a little bit more about your research process, as a curator putting together the exhibition, and we're going to discuss a few sort of case studies. And the first one we're going to look at is Antonio Lopez, who is a name that not everybody may know, but a really fabulous Puerto Rican-born fashion illustrator whose work appeared in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Interview, Elle, etc. And is known for having sort of discovered Jessica Lange and worked with Jerry Hall in Paris in the early 70s before she really truly became a star model, and others like Grace Jones as well. So tell us about where sort of Antonio Lopez fits into the story.
Well, and as I mentioned earlier, there were 4 designers asked to make proposals for the logo, and one of them was Antonio Lopez, but his wasn't chosen. But they asked Antonio if he would design costumes for the Alvin Ailey Dance Company for the opening night. They had asked Alvin Ailey if he would choreograph a production, and they ended up the choreography ended up being by Kay Thompson, who's a writer, designer, and most famously, if you watch the movie Funny Face, she plays the magazine editor and does Think Pink. Antonio, as you can see here, did beautiful drawings. I got in touch with the Antonio Lopez estate and I said, I'm looking for costume drawings from 1977. And a couple days later, I got an email back and they said they found a brown envelope and it said Costume Designs 1977. It hadn't been opened in 40 years. And we opened it up and it was 52 drawings of the dancers' costumes for that opening night.
Yeah, and you can see, all of those drawings in our exhibition. They're really fabulous, and they have that feeling of, like you said, Matthew, material that has been sort of undiscovered and hasn't been seen in years. It's really quite fabulous, and we have 2 or 3 cases of them in the first exhibition the first gallery in the exhibition. Tell us a little bit about his diary. I mean, this is fun because it's really from that opening dawn moment of when the club opened.
Yeah. So they took photographs. His partner Juan Ramos took photographs, and Antonio kept 2 kinds of diaries. He kept a written diary and he kept a visual diary. This is an example of the visual diary, and you can see he again redrew some of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company costumes, and he would frequently tape in Polaroids or just kind of his own impressions of the evening. It's kind of extraordinary.
Great. Moving on a little bit, I want to sort of focus a little bit on fashion because it's obviously a great area of expertise for you. And the exhibition includes some wonderful works by Zandra Rhodes. And here you are standing with Zandra. Could you just sort of tell us about your dialogue with her around that moment and for this exhibition?
I think you might have seen the one of the signature images for the show of Pat Cleveland in a pleated lame dress, which I think we're going to see in a little bit. And
yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Yes. And I sent an email to Zandra, and I said, I'm looking for this dress. She said, well, when Pat wore it, she kept the dress, and I got a hold of Pat Cleveland, and it turned out that she had it. So I was going to London. I met with Zandra. She went in her archive. She found a trunk that had dresses that she'd worn to Studio 54. So they're also in the exhibit. And so Zandra was coming to New York, and I said, you should come and look at the dress. It's pleated lame. It's been in storage for 40 years. I want to make sure that you're cool with how it looks. And so she came in and she wore her fried egg pin and her signature pink hair. And
there she is, yeah.
Yeah. She's 80 years old. And we went into storage, and she couldn't believe what good care Pat Cleveland had taken of the dress. So
that's fantastic. So she sort of reunited with, sort of lovingly, with something that she'd made so many years before. Yeah. Just this next slide, I really love the transition because here we're going to go from black and white to color, and you can see that many people I know, when you think of that dress as maybe being silver, here it is in this beautiful eye-popping gold. I mean, tell us a bit, Matthew, just about the quality of the craftsmanship here, what we're looking at.
Well, one of the great things about Zandra is that she started out as a textile designer, and her mother was an artist, and she was very much interested in doing very technical fabrics. And she wasn't having much luck convincing designers to use her textiles, so she started designing dresses herself. And what happens is if you go to Zandra's studio, and she actually has a textile museum in London, if you're in London, she designs things by these pieces, and then she sews them together. And this in particular, each of the individual pieces was pleated before it was sewn together. And it's such an extraordinary process.
It's just quite extraordinary in purpose. Excuse me, in person to see this dress. It's really very beautiful.
Well,
I want
and you'll also notice, when you see her designs, they're maybe a little bit more eccentric than a
yes,
traditional design because she's coming at fashion design from a completely different planet than
right.
most designers. Most designers are like making a pattern on a sheet of paper, cutting it out. But Zandra starts from either making the fabric or silk screening it. And that is the piece that she then sews together. So
Yeah.
they're kind of works of art.
Yes, they are indeed. There's no question about that. Moving along a little bit, let's sort of compare, in a way, Zandra Rhodes to another great designer, Halston. And here you see him embracing Liza Minnelli, who was, they were great friends. She was also an important client for him. By the way, just behind the two of them embracing, you can see the white head of hair of Andy Warhol, who's in the front row making a snapshot. But tell us a little bit about this relationship, because there's some beautiful garments in the show that I'm going to present in a second. But tell us a little bit about Minnelli and Halston.
Well, they met in the early 70s, and she was talking to him about, one of the best stories is she was talking to him about designing clothes for Liza with a Z, which was a television program in the early 70s. And Halston went to see her perform, and after her performance, she came backstage and her hair was all black and wet and shiny. And she said, well, what do you think you're going to do? And he said, I think I'm going to do something black and wet and shiny looking. And that's when he started doing those black sequin pieces for her. We have an example
Just going ahead
on the
now.
left here
Yeah.
of the black sequin. This example that we have in the show is actually from Lauren Bacall, but it's the same idea.
Yeah.
But on the right, you see one of her dresses. And at the time, Halston had installed disco lights in his atelier because while he was designing clothes, he wanted to see how they were going to look in nightclubs. But also he wanted to use beading, which of course is very heavy. And so when you look at the beaded ones, you'll notice that they're spaced apart. So you still get the reflection of the beading, but it's light.
Yes.
And so you can move and dance in it,
Yeah.
but it's not going to like weigh you down.
Yes, yes, yeah, that's great. I just want to flip back. This is kind of her sitting and more relaxing at a party here, obviously, where she's wearing a different piece. But he specifically designed these two-piece suits, as it were. The pant and the suit combo. That was a very typical solution for her, was it not?
It is. And what I'll also say about this particular moment, this is 11:30 at night at a dinner. On September 4th, 1979, Liza Minnelli did her first night at Carnegie Hall for what became the longest run of any artist at Carnegie Hall till this day. And if you ever hear the album Liza Live at Carnegie Hall, it's this concert that she's just arrived from. And in the banter, in between one of the songs, she talks about how, I'm the kind of girl that likes to sit home and read a book at night, and I don't go out at all, So, but then she says, but I love to go to Studio 54. So,
yeah. Well, she really was a habitué. I mean, she seemed to spend a lot of time there, right?
Yeah, she was there a lot. There's, great photographs of her there through the entire history. She was there the first year, and she was there the last night for Steve and Ian's going away party.
Great. The next sort of thing I want to talk about is photography and the relationship, especially between, in a way, the club and how it was run by Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager, and how smart and clever they were at sort of publicizing what was happening there, and of course sort of driving this sort of the cult of celebrity in a way. And one of the preeminent celebrity photographers, even paparazzo, you could say, of that time, is the wonderful Ron Galella, who you're standing next to in this picture. And you can see just to his right and your right, extraordinary portraits of Sophia Loren and Jackie Kennedy and Marlon Brando, and so it goes on. And just to the left of your shoulder, Andy Warhol again. But tell us about the conversations you had with Ron Galella. I'm going to show a few images in a second, but how you worked with Ron.
Oh my gosh, Ron. Ron just celebrated his 90th birthday on Sunday. So go Ron. Ron was in the Army. He studied photography after he got out, and he started shooting in Los Angeles, and then he started working for various magazines. Early in the century, there was the National Enquirer, which had gone out of fashion. But in the 1970s, there were a rise of what became known as supermarket tabloids. People magazine was new, Star magazine was new, Us magazine was new. And the photographers were trying to get exclusives. And if they had an exclusive, they could charge more money. It would be in the tabloid. And then the nightclub would get more publicity. And so it was a nice cycle for everybody. What would happen is that if you had 2 or 3 celebrities at Studio 54 on one night, Steve would delegate which photographer got to shoot which celebrity. Right. And so then they would all get exclusives and they would make more money and more publicity. So it was a merry-go-round.
It certainly was. And here's just a couple of examples, one in color and one in black and white. I love this picture of Grace Jones and Andy Warhol. You can see again Warhol's camera around his neck, ever ready. He made a lot of pictures there and elsewhere during this time. And then this fabulous color shot of Olivia Newton-John in her spandex pants and to celebrate the opening of Grease. But
it's just auctioned this past year.
Is that right?
A lot of money, yeah.
So these are the kind of candid people pictures that Galella especially was excelled at. I mean, there are many others in the exhibition like Merrill Meisler and Alan Tannenbaum and so forth, but Galella is one of the standouts, I would say, and because of his Go ahead, sorry.
And what's interesting about what the pairing that you're showing here is it shows you that Ron was carrying 2 cameras. He would carry one taking black and white and one would be taking color. And because at that time he had different magazines, had different requirements. Today everything's 4 color, but not back then. It was still 2 color and it was still film. This was pre-digital.
Yeah.
And so what's great about the Ron Galella black and white prints in the show is that they're vintage prints. Ron had his own studio. He developed his own black and white film, made his own prints. So they're beautiful black and white prints from the 1970s. Well, first on the right, you see young Michael Jackson. It was after the premiere of the movie The Turning Point, which is a great ballet film if you like ballet. On the left is a photograph that became known as Fat Liz. And it was on the cover of Kenneth Anger's book, Hollywood Babylon 2.
Yeah. And
what happened here is Ron confessed. He said that he'd had a camera, and because he knew Liz was going to get into the limousine, he'd made a camera with a fixed lens and a flash. So when she got in the limousine, he put the camera lens again and flashed it. And because of the distortion of the lens, Liz, she got a little bit bigger. It's a little bit of a unfortunate photograph, but the wonder of photography, right?
Exactly. Yes, it's both truth and fiction at the same time. I mean, I think I'm right in saying this, Matthew. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't he actually banned from the studio for a while because there was an altercation between, I think, the bouncers or the security staff and himself because he was sort of pushing himself into places where he shouldn't be. I mean, he was always hanging around by the backstage door and trying to get the front row shots. And I think
Yeah.
they needed him, but he was also a pest, I suppose, right?
Well, and a lot of other photographers talk about the fact that he would elbow them out of the way so he could get closer.
Yeah.
Well, he did. He got banned twice. The first time he got banned because he took a photograph of an actress who had a plunging neckline, and you could see her tits. And so, and he sold that photograph, and it was not good. So he was banned for a month.
Yeah.
And they let him back in, things were fine. And then there was a camera crew shooting a documentary about him, and the camera people got in an altercation with the bouncers at the studio. And police came, and then it turned out the studio had also had a violation for something. And so Steve ended up spending 33 hours in jail. And in the show, you can see his diary on the back of drink tickets from that night.
That's
from
great.
that night on, from that night on, Ron was banned completely. And what he would do is, because he wasn't allowed inside, but knew there was, great pictures to be taken, he did the front door and the back door. And the Liz Taylor one is from that, a backdoor photo.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question that's come from our viewers about fashion, which I want to come back to in a second, but we'll keep moving for a moment or two because there's a few other, of course, we want to talk a little bit about Margaret Trudeau, the spouse of the Prime Minister here, Pierre Trudeau. They had sort of technically separated in 77, even though they didn't divorce until 84, but she was regularly there. And here we see both a photograph by Ron Galella and then this fabulous sort of collage and spray drawing by Richard Bernstein, who was the artist who worked closely for Interview magazine. So, Trudeau was one of those people who was always at the club during that period, right?
Margaret, I saw a lot of photographs of Margaret at Studio 54, and she enjoyed having a good time. And some nights she had on a little bit more revealing outfits than others. And I think there probably took maybe a few more pictures of her when she wore those outfits.
Yeah.
But she was so famous at the time that Andy Warhol said that she should be on the cover of Interview magazine. And that's the image on the left. Many people think that Andy Warhol did the covers of Interview, but they were actually done by Richard Bernstein.
Yeah. So that's one of the Canadian connections in the exhibition. We also, the singer Bryan Adams was a regular at the club during this time, and the filmmaker Betty Ferguson also made important films that relate to the history of Studio 54. Just a couple of other kind of characters or protagonists, if you like, to mention before we open up to a few questions. Grace Jones, just a fabulous model, singer, performance artist from that period. We've already seen other photographs of her, but maybe you could sort of tell us a little bit about how she fits into the story, Matthew.
Well, the funny thing is when I first started doing research for it, she had been married to a man named Jean-Paul Goude for a long time, and or a short time, depending on how you look at it. But I was in touch with Jean-Paul and I said, I'm trying to find images of Grace at Studio 54. And he said, oh, you'll never find them. She never went there. And of course, that wasn't true. Grace Jones was at Studio 54 a lot. And I think it was just because Jean-Paul wasn't into disco music himself. So Grace was invited to perform on New Year's Eve in 77, 78, and they made a big set for her that looked like a cobra, which was the night of the Cobra movie. The director, Rod Link, who directed the production, Grace came out at 3 o'clock in the morning wearing this Norma Kamali outfit. And she sang 4 songs from her first album, Portfolio, because up to that point, Grace was really known as a model.
Yeah.
And she had been in Issey Miyake's fashion show 12 Black Girls, which toured around Japan and became very well known. So, here you can see Grace can wear anything, and she does.
Yeah. I think one of the things we haven't really talked about too much this evening, but we'll talk actually on the 20th when you discuss things with Paul Matheson, is this is a good cue for it though, this photograph, where the number of special events and parties that were hosted at the club as part of its sort of menu of offerings, if you like. And can you just say a little bit about the sort of variety and the richness of the different fashion shows and celebrations they would have?
Well, when Studio started in the 70s, it did host a lot of fashion shows. Kenzo had his first fashion show in New York at Studio 54. Charles Jourdan had a shoe fashion show at Studio 54. Giorgio Armani, when he did his first show in New York, his party was held at Studio 54. And a lot of fashionable things happened there. There's also the great story about Calvin Klein being at Studio, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, someone came up to him and said, "Have you ever considered designing jeans, blue jeans?" And
Yeah.
of course, we all know what happened. So it was, Steve Rubell often said that in the 1960s, the people that were most famous were the rock and roll singers. And in the 70s, it was the fashion designers. And in the 80s, it was the painters.
Yeah.
And so this Studio 54 was really one of the places where if you were interested in fashion, you would go and see all the designers there.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that, the club is, of course, a sort of nexus for personal expression and liberation, and in that way that almost the notion of self-invention, but it's also because of the way that the founders operated it, it's this nexus for business and commerce and wheeling and dealing, which is another really interesting aspect of it, I feel. So you get all these different creative components mixing together.
You do. I mean, Steve always talked about the fact that he wanted the crowd at Studio 54 to be like a great dinner party at your home, where you would invite a mix of people. And there was a reporter in New York named Judy Licht, and she asked Mark Benecke, the doorman, about how he picked people to get inside from that massive crowd that we saw in that first image. And Mark said it was always about energy. What kind of energy were you going to bring to the room? You didn't want to have a room full of accountants who could all afford the door ticket, but then you'd have a boring room,
I'm just going to sort of still the presentation for a moment on this slide so you can see a mix of all kinds of different images from the club and the wonderful complimentary tickets on the left. But there's a really interesting question that's come in from one of our viewers, Ingrid Meader, who's wonderful. She's a terrific historian of fashion, actually. And I'll just read the question to you because it's a good one. I'm curious to know how you went about selecting the clothing that's on display. Aside from the Zandra Rhodes for Pat Cleveland and the Halston pieces for Liza Minnelli, are most of the pieces meant to be representative of the period, or are they intentionally matched to the photographs? And also, is most of it from the Brooklyn Museum or loans? And anything that you couldn't, a few questions, anything that you wanted to display but couldn't find?
Okay. Well, first of all of the clothing and costumes in the show are loans. And all of the clothes are from the late 70s. What I would say is that I did start out trying to find the clothes that were in the pictures. That was definitely what I wanted to do. And when you see, for example, Doris Duke's white sequin jumpsuit in the show, or Pat's outfit, or the sleeping bag coat, there are one-to-one correlation. Here's a photograph of it being worn at Studio, here's the outfit. But eventually you start having conversations with people where they tell you, oh, I had that outfit, but I grew out of it. I couldn't fit into it anymore, so I gave it away. And
Yeah.
I started having a lot of sad stories. So, but then you have some joyous ones, the gold chainmail halter top and the gold chainmail Farrah Fawcett dress were in beautiful condition for the show. And Liza Minnelli had at an auction 3 years ago where she included some of the outfits that you see in the show. And they were purchased by a man named Mark Payne. Mark had been a Liza Minnelli impersonator in the late 70s, early
Really?
80s.
Yeah.
And so he was very much, focused on having a good Liza collection. So it's a variety of lenders, and I really tried to be true to the period. And I also wanted to make sure that we had beautiful examples of clothes from the 70s, because I think oftentimes we think it's just the platform shoes and a white suit with a black shirt, and we call it a day and say, oh, weren't the 70s a terrible fashion period? But actually it wasn't. It was a beautiful time for American design.
Yeah, the one of the, just sort of related to Ingrid's question, I mean, one of the designers that is an important part of the narrative is Yves Saint Laurent, and we did have a couple of items that were impacted by COVID that couldn't travel to Toronto, sadly. And that's a normal situation in any major exhibition like the one that Matthew organized that is designed to travel. It's going to go, COVID permitting, to Europe after its presentation in Toronto. And these beautiful items of fashion are very fragile. I mean, they're very sensitive, and they can't be moved around the globe all that easily. So there are those similar sort of conservation issues that we have with any other media that we care for at the AGO and that we present to our public. So those are that's another practical consideration that's part of a very ambitious show like this, that, by the way, has something like 500 objects. Isn't that right, Matthew? Something in that order.
Yes.
It's extraordinary.
Yes.
So yeah, quite a feat to do that, I would say, during COVID times. I just want to sort of wrap up in a way by presenting this last picture, which shows you the opening exhibition of the opening gallery, I should say, at the AGO. And you'll see these red stripes down the middle of the floor. They're actually projected from above to give a sense of the safe passageway for all of you once you come back to the gallery. There's enough space here to look at artworks on either side of the gallery, but also sort of pass down the middle and move into the next space if you wish to. And we've had to make some very significant adaptations of the installation to be able to safely accommodate all of you when you come back to see the show. Another question, it's a very specific one, Matthew, has to do with the Textile Museum in London. One of our viewers is asking, whereabouts is that in London? Maybe you could just say a couple of quick things about the Textile Museum.
Oh, well, the Textile Museum was founded by Zonda Rhodes, and it includes both historic textiles as well as her own designs. And it's near the Shard. If you go to London, you could do two things. You could take that nice elevator up to the top of the Shard and have a cocktail, and then go to the Textile Museum, or vice versa.
That's great. Matthew, I want to thank you so much for sharing your deep knowledge with our audience this evening. It's been wonderful, really great. And just personally, it's been such a joy to work with you in this way. It's extraordinary, really. Matthew and I have never met each other in person. I mean, such as COVID. Under normal circumstances, we would have traveled to Brooklyn, the team of us from the AGO, to see the exhibition there, to talk to Matthew and his colleagues. And we've done all of this over the screen. And I don't say that to be self-referential, but just it's the sort of bizarre times that we're living in. But I feel that we've created something that's very special for our Toronto public, and we can't wait to share it with you once it's safe to do so. Please follow our website, ago.ca, closely to get updates on our reopening, which we hope will happen as soon as possible. I want to also mention, again, the talk that Matthew will be doing on January the 20th at 6 p.m. with Paul Matheson. You can go to our website to register for that. And again, Paul is an installation technician here at the AGO, who's a great member of our team, who worked in the Studio 54 in these heyday years. And so that'll be a fabulous conversation with a lot of interesting sort of behind the curtain conversation around the way that the club operated from night to night, and what Paul's experience was like, and how in a way Paul as a lighting designer, Matthew as an exhibition designer will be discussing the work that they do together. I want to just finally close by also saying that please join us again on February the 9th for an update on the AGO's European collection by Dr. Caroline Shields, our Associate Curator and Head of European Art. You'll hear from Caroline about our exciting program in that area. So that's the next up in the series of Curators Circle talks. And until then, please stay safe and be well. It's a difficult and harsh environment out there, but we can't wait to welcome you to back to the AGO and to Studio 54 Night Magic as soon as we possibly can. Good evening, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Matthew. Bye-bye.